Thousands of years before telescopes, ancient mystics calculated the age of the universe with stunning accuracy. Science is just catching up. Think about what that means for one moment. Not inspired poetry, not a lucky guess wrapped in metaphor. A calculation, a number arrived at through the close. Careful study of sacred texts written in a language that carries the weight of eternity in every syllable. And then, centuries later, the most sophisticated instruments humanity has ever built. Telescopes orbiting the Earth, satellites measuring the whisper of ancient light at the edge of creation, arrive at a number that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Because it matches, not roughly, not in the ballpark. It matches in a way that cannot be dismissed, cannot be waved away, and cannot be explained by coincidence alone. I want you to hold that thought. Really hold it. Because we live in a world that has spent decades telling a particular story about the relationship between ancient religion and modern science. The story goes like this: science grows up, religion gets pushed out. The story goes that every new discovery is one more step in the long retreat of faith. One more territory surrendered to the advancing army of evidence. According to this story, the people of faith are always on the defensive, always explaining, always apologizing, always trying to rescue meaning from the corners that science has not yet illuminated. That is the story. And I am here to tell you that story is wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally, foundationally, demonstrably wrong. And the proof of that is sitting in a text written 700 years ago by a man who had never seen a telescope and who arrived at a number that the James Webb Space Telescope is still working to confirm. That is not faith retreating. That is faith arriving first. I want to be honest with you from the start. My name is Dr. Elias Bornstein, and I have spent over 40 years at the intersection of physics, biblical scholarship, and the ancient wisdom traditions of the Jewish people. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am here to show you what is written, what was calculated, and what science has confirmed. After that, what you do with it is entirely between you and the one who set the stars in motion. But before I take you into the mathematics and the mysticism, before I show you the precise calculation, a 13th century sage wrote down in a book most people have never heard of, I need to ask you something. Are you the kind of person who has been told all your life that faith and science are enemies? Have you ever sat in a science class or watched a documentary and felt a quiet, uncomfortable war inside your chest? A war between what you were taught to believe and what the textbooks were saying. Do you feel like you have to choose? Like the universe is forcing you to pick a side? Either God or evidence. Either ancient truth or modern discovery. If that is you, stop everything and write this in the comments right now. Write the words, "My faith has no ceiling." Write it. Because that is the declaration of someone who understands that the more we discover, the bigger God becomes. Not smaller, bigger. Like and subscribe if this channel is where you come to have that confirmed. Hit the bell so you never miss a revelation. Now let us begin. The teaching I am about to share with you has been sitting in the libraries of Jewish scholars for 7 centuries. It has been discussed in hushed tones by rabbis who understood its explosive implication. It was largely ignored by the mainstream because the mainstream did not yet have the tools to understand what it was saying. And then, in the last decades of the 20th century, physicists and cosmologists began publishing numbers, and scholars began pointing at ancient texts. And suddenly, something that had been hidden in plain sight became one of the most electrifying convergences in the history of human knowledge. Let me give you the foundation before I give you the number. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. That is the consensus of modern cosmology. Confirmed by multiple independent lines of investigation, the European Space Agency's Planck satellite, the Atacama Cosmology Telescope in Chile, the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light in existence. All of these instruments have been pointed at the edge of creation, and they have come back with the same answer. Roughly 13.8 billion years. Some estimates have placed it closer to 15 billion. For the purposes of what I am about to show you, remember this: science says the universe is somewhere between 13.8 and 15 billion years old. Now open the Torah to the very first word, Bereshit, in the beginning. That is what it means in English. But in Hebrew, a language where every letter is a world and every word is a window, the translation barely scratches the surface. The root of Bereshit is Rosh, meaning head, the point of origin, the place from which everything flows. The great medieval commentator Nachmanides, the Ramban, who lived from 1194 to 1270 in Girona, Spain, wrote something in his commentary on Genesis that stunned every physicist who has ever read it with careful eyes. He wrote that in the first instant of creation, all of the matter and energy of the universe was compressed into a point so small, so densely concentrated, that it had virtually no physical dimension at all. He called it a yesh mayin, something from nothing, and a creative event so singular and so total that nothing that came before it can even be spoken of in the language of time or space. Nachmanides wrote this in the 13th century. We call it the Big Bang. He called it the first act of creation. And the language he used for the initial substance, the word he chose for the raw primordial material of existence, is the same word physicists use today when they describe the early universe. Pure energy, pure potential, formless, boundless. Then, in one sovereign instant, everything, listen to me carefully, Nachmanides also wrote about time itself. He understood, 700 years before Einstein, that time is not a constant, that the experience of duration depends on the perspective of the observer, that what is one moment from one vantage point can be an era of unimaginable length from another. This is not mysticism dressed up to sound like physics. This is the original text. This is what he wrote, and it leads us directly to the hidden calculation. Somewhere in the 13th century, a Kabbalist by the name of Rabbi Isaac of Akko wrote a work called Otsar HaHayim, a treasury of life. Rabbi Isaac was a student in the tradition of the Ramban. He lived in the land of Israel and was a deeply serious scholar. And in this remarkable text, he did something extraordinary. He tried to calculate the age of the universe using the tools of Kabbalistic cosmology. Specifically, the concept of the Sabbatical cycles. Here is what that means. Ancient Jewish tradition, embedded in texts attributed to the 2nd century teacher Rabbi Nehunia ben Hakana, and elaborated in the Kabbalistic work known as Sefer HaTemuna, held that time operates in large cosmic cycles, each cycle lasting 7,000 years. Before our present era, the tradition teaches, other worlds existed, other cycles of creation and dissolution, like waves in an infinite sea, each one rising and falling according to the divine plan. How many cycles? 7? 7 great cosmic cycles, each 7,000 years long. And here is where Rabbi Isaac of Akko's reasoning becomes astonishing. He asked a question that sounds simple but contains a universe of implication. When Scripture and tradition speak of divine time, when God's time is referenced, what is the unit of measure? And he turned, as the sages have always turned, to the Psalms. Psalm 150. Verse 4. Read it again. King David writes, or rather Moses writes, because this is the only psalm attributed to Moses himself. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday, when it is past, and as a watch in the night. 1,000 of our years equals one divine day. Read it again. 1,000 years, one day, in the sight of the Creator of the universe. 1,000 of our years is like a single day. This is not metaphor in the conventional sense. Rabbi Isaac took it as a literal cosmological conversion factor. If one divine day equals 1,000 of our years, then one divine year, 365 days, equals 365, 250 of our years. That is one divine year, a year in God's time. Now apply that to the 6 cosmic cycles before the creation of Adam, the 6 great eras that the Kabbalistic tradition describes as preceding our own. According to certain interpretations of the tradition, when Adam was created, the universe was already 42,000 divine years old. 42,000 divine years. Now multiply 42. 0 times 365. Liambai Wusher. Do that calculation, carry it out to the end. The result is 15. Sambai Sisher. Wubat. 000 years. 15,340,500,000 years. That is what Rabbi Isaac of Akko arrived at in the 13th century. That is what he wrote in a book. Science places the age of the universe at 13. 8 to 15 billion years. Stop right there. 700 years before modern cosmology. 700 years before anyone had a telescope powerful enough to see the echo of the Big Bang. 700 years before the Hubble Space Telescope. Before the Planck satellite. Before the Atacama Observatory in Chile. A Kabbalist in medieval Israel sat with his sacred texts and arrived at a number that lands squarely in the range that the finest scientific instruments on Earth have confirmed. Not a ballpark. Not vaguely in the right direction. Within the same range. Now, I want to be honest with you, because integrity matters and this teaching demands it. There is scholarly debate about the precise interpretation of Rabbi Isaac's text. Some scholars argue that according to his own reading, we are in the 2nd cosmic cycle, not the 7th, which would produce a different number. The full calculation that yields 15 billion depends on combining certain interpretive choices about which cycle we are currently in. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, the 20th century physicist and rabbi who brought this entire conversation into the modern era, acknowledged the complexity. He laid it all out in his work on immortality, resurrection, and the age of the universe. And what he concluded, what strikes anyone who reads that analysis with an open mind, is this: even if the specific number 15 billion depends on interpretive choices, the fundamental claim stands. Medieval Jewish mystics, using the tools of sacred cosmology, arrived at the conclusion that the universe is billions of years old, not thousands, billions, at a time when the entire surrounding civilization assumed the earth was young. That changes everything. Are you beginning to feel the weight of this? Have you ever stopped to ask why this convergence does not get more attention? Do you realize that most people sitting in churches and synagogues and mosques across America have never heard this teaching? Have never been shown that the tension between ancient faith and modern science may not be a tension at all, but a convergence that was always waiting for the instruments to catch up? I want you to sit with that question, because here is what it means for your life. Not abstractly, not academically. Here, in your life, in your doubt, in those moments when someone dismisses your faith as superstition, as wishful thinking for people who cannot handle the cold mathematics of an indifferent universe. Here is what it means. The same tradition that gave you the Sabbath, the same tradition that gave you the commandment to love your neighbor, the same tradition that gave you the promise of restoration and redemption. That tradition also contains a 700-year-old calculation of the age of the universe that falls within the range of modern cosmology. Does that sound like superstition to you? It does not sound like superstition to me. It sounds like a revelation that was planted in the ancient text, like a seed, waiting for the moment in history when the soil of human knowledge would be ready to receive it. Now let me take you deeper, because there is another layer to this. And this layer comes not from the Kabbalists but from physics itself. From Einstein, Dr. Gerald Schroeder is a physicist who trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and served on the United States Atomic Energy Commission. He is not a theologian making his way through physics textbooks. He is a physicist who made his way through theology. And in his books, including Genesis and the Big Bang and the Science of God, he laid out an argument so elegant that even non-believers have had to stop and take notice. Here is the argument. Einstein showed us that time is not a constant. Time moves differently depending on the speed of the observer and the gravitational field they are in. This is not theory in the speculative sense. This is tested, confirmed, experimentally verified physics. The GPS in your phone would not work without accounting for the fact that time runs slightly differently in orbit than it does on the ground. Now apply that to the beginning of creation. At the moment of the Big Bang, the universe was expanding at an unimaginable rate. The cosmic clock, the clock that was measuring time from the perspective of that original creative moment, was ticking at a radically different rate than the clock that we, billions of years later, use to measure geological and cosmological time looking backward. Schroeder used the cosmic microwave background radiation, the precise temperature of the oldest light in the universe, to calculate the stretching factor between those two reference frames. And when he applied Einstein's equations to the 6 days of Genesis, when he translated 6 divine days at the original creative reference frame into what those same 6 days would look like to an observer looking back from the present, the number he arrived at was approximately 15. 75 billion years, 6 days, 15.75 billion years, the same event, described from 2 different positions in time. One position is the vantage point of eternity. The other is ours. And the Rambin, writing in Spain in the 13th century, had already said that the first days of creation were of an entirely different character than the days that followed, that they cannot be understood through the framework of ordinary human time. I want you to feel the force of this. 2 independent lines of calculation. The medieval Kabbalistic mathematics of Rabbi Isaac of Akko and the relativistic physics of a 20th century MIT physicist drawing on the commentaries of Nachmanides, both landing in the same territory, and both landing in the territory that modern cosmology has staked out with its most sophisticated instruments. Not one coincidence. Tuvo. Now, I need to speak to you directly for a moment, not as a scholar, As someone who has stood exactly where you may be standing right now, there is a kind of suffering that does not show up on medical charts. It does not have a name in the DSM, but you know it. You know it as the low, persistent ache of feeling torn between the world of your ancestors and the world your education opened up for you, torn between the faith that gives your life meaning and the intellectual framework that your career, your peers, your culture demands from you. You love God. You believe. Somewhere deep in the part of you that wakes at 3 in the morning and hears the silence and knows it is not empty. But you have been made to feel, sometimes subtly and sometimes not subtly at all. That belief is for people who have not thought hard enough, that intelligence and faith are inversely proportional, that the more you know, the less you can believe. That lie has cost a generation its soul, and I am here to tell you it is a lie. Not wishful thinking, not motivated reasoning. A lie that is contradicted by the actual content of the ancient texts, by the real history of Jewish and Christian scholarship, and, as we have seen today, by the mathematics of cosmology itself. The sages were not ignorant. They were not waiting for science to come rescue them from their primitive worldview. They were looking at the same universe you and I live in, through the lens of revelation. And they were seeing things that we are only now, with all our instruments and equations, beginning to verify. Someone watching this right now needs to hear this. You have been thinking about walking away, not from God. You have never really stopped believing, but from the community, from the faith tradition, from the conversation, because you feel like you cannot stay without checking your brain at the door. I am telling you directly, stay. Not because it is comfortable, because the texts are richer than you have been told, because the tradition contains depths that have not been shown to you yet, because the same sacred library that gave us the prayer book and the ethical code also contains a medieval cosmological calculation that matches the output of modern astrophysics. And no one thought to show you that before now. Stay. The door you were about to walk through leads somewhere smaller, not somewhere larger. Now let me give you something practical, something you can do, because wisdom that does not change how you live is just information. And information without transformation is a very expensive way to feel educated. Here is a practice I am going to give you. Not a 3-day challenge, not a program, a posture, a way of approaching the ancient text that will change the way you read, the way you pray, and the way you experience the world. Step 1. Every time you encounter a verse that seems to contradict what you know about the world, before you dismiss it, before you allegorize it away until it contains nothing, before you read a commentary that flattens it into harmlessness, stop. Ask the question the Kabbalists always asked. Ask what this verse would mean if it were exactly as precise and as literally true as the finest scientific measurement. Not does it mean something spiritual, that is always true. Ask whether it might also mean something physical, something encoded in the fabric of creation, waiting for the moment in history when human beings would have the instruments and the equations to decode it. This is not a call to naive literalism. Nachmanides himself would reject naive literalism. This is a call to what might be called reverent precision, the assumption that the ancient text is more, not less, than what it appears to be at the surface. Step 2. Read Psalm 90 again. Slowly. The whole psalm is attributed to Moses. Think about the person who is writing it. The man who stood at the burning bush, the man who parted the waters, the man who received the Torah at Sinai in the midst of fire and cloud, When Moses writes that 1,000 years in God's sight are like yesterday, you are reading the reflection of a man who has been in proximity to eternity. He is not using a nice metaphor for how time passes quickly. He is encoding a cosmological truth that a medieval Jewish mystic would later use to calculate the age of the universe. Read it with that in mind, and let the weight of what Moses knew settle into you. Step 3. Find one person in your life, one person who also lives in that torn space, who also carries the tension between faith and knowledge, and share this teaching with them, not to win an argument, not to say I told you so, because the suffering of that particular loneliness, the loneliness of the person who loves both God and science and is told they cannot have both, is unnecessary, and you have a gift for them. Give it. And step 4. This is the one that costs something. Sit in the question, not the question of whether God exists, not the question of whether the ancient texts are true, but the deeper, more productive question. What else is in here that we have not found yet? What other seeds of knowledge are encoded in the ancient library, waiting for the moment in history when the soil is ready? What else has been hiding in the Hebrew letters, in the Kabbalistic mathematics, in the commentary traditions, that the next generation of scholars and scientists will uncover and find confirmed? Sit in that question, not as a source of anxiety, but as a source of awe. Because a universe that hides its age in a medieval mystical text is a universe that is not indifferent. That is a universe that is speaking, and the question is whether we have trained ourselves to hear. Let me bring you back to the numbers one more time, because I want you to be able to tell this story to someone else. I want you to have the facts, not just the feeling. The scientific consensus, confirmed by multiple independent methods, including the Planck satellite data and the Atacama cosmology telescope, places the age of the universe at approximately 8 billion years, with a range that extends toward 15 billion, depending on the measurement technique. Rabbi Isaac of Akko, a 13th century Kabbalist and student of the tradition of Nachmanides, working from the concept of divine time articulated in Psalm 90, verse 4, and from the Kabbalistic framework of the Sabbatical cycles as described in Sefer HaTemunah and attributed to the ancient teacher Rabbi Nehunia ben Hakana, arrived at a figure of approximately 34 billion years for the age of the universe at the time of the creation of Adam. Dr. Gerald Schroeder, a physicist trained at MIT, applying Einstein's theory of relativity and the time dilation effect to the 6 days of Genesis, using the cosmic microwave background temperature as the stretching factor, arrived at approximately 75 billion years. Modern science trace 8 to 15 billion. Rabbi Isaac of Akko, 13th century 34 billion. Gerald Schroeder, 20th century, using medieval commentaries and Einstein's equations, 75 billion. That is what we are talking about. Now, I want to say one more thing about what the Talmud preserves on this question, because it is relevant and because it has been verified. The Talmud, in Tractate Chagiga at chapter 13, and Tractate Shabbat at chapter 88, records that there were 974 generations before Adam, not hundreds, not a few dozen, 974 generations. When you read that alongside the Midrashic tradition, found in Kohelet Rabbah, chapter 3, verse 14, that God created and destroyed multiple worlds before our own, And when you hold both of those traditions alongside the Kabbalistic framework of the Sabbatical cycles, you see a picture emerging, a picture of a universe that is ancient, a universe that is not 6,000 years old in any simple sense, but a universe whose creative history stretches back through depths of time that have always been reflected in the sacred library. The ancient teachers knew something was there. They did not have the instruments to measure it from the outside, but they had the text. And in the text, they found encoded, waiting like a letter sealed and addressed to a future generation, the number that would only be arrived at by the most sophisticated scientific project in human history over 2,000 years later. I am a scientist. I am also a man of faith. I have spent 4 decades watching people forced to choose between those two identities, as though the universe itself required the conflict. And every year, every decade, the evidence points in the same direction. Not toward conflict, toward convergence. Not toward a universe that abandoned us in its indifference. Toward a universe whose very structure, whose very ancient light, encodes the knowledge that was given to the sages before the instruments existed to confirm it. This is not the end of the investigation. It is the beginning, because if the age of the universe was hidden in the Hebrew letters, if it was waiting in the mathematics of divine time, if it was encoded in the framework of the Sabbatical cycles for 700 years before science could read it, then the question that matters now is not whether the ancient tradition is compatible with science. The question is how much more is in there. How many more seeds? How many more calculations? How many more windows into the structure of reality have been sitting in the ancient library, waiting for the moment in history when the world would be ready to look? Someone watching this right now, you have spent years feeling like you had to apologize for your faith in intellectual company. You have softened it, qualified it, prefaced it with disclaimers. You have learned to hold it quietly, carefully, as though it were a fragile thing that could not survive the weight of a hard question. I am telling you something different. Your faith is not fragile. The tradition that carries it is not fragile. It is deep enough to have hidden the age of the universe in a Kabbalistic calculation for 7 centuries and waited, patient as the stars themselves, for the moment when the telescopes would come online and the numbers would match. You were not given a small God. You were given a small view of God. And today that view just got larger. The tradition carries more than you have been shown. The ancient library is deeper than you have been allowed to go. And the convergence of faith and knowledge is not a project that is waiting to happen. It has been happening. Slowly. Century by century. Calculation by calculation. Instrument by instrument. For as long as human beings have been reaching toward the source of everything, now here is what I want you to do before this video ends. Go to the comments and write the words. The ancient words still speak. Write it. Not because it is a formula, not because it will change your circumstances automatically, but because the act of declaring something plants it deeper in your consciousness, and because someone else who is watching this conversation in the comments, someone who has never heard this teaching, someone who is still convinced they have to choose, will see those words and know they are not alone. The ancient words still speak. Write it now, and subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going deeper. Because this is one thread in a much longer tapestry. The convergence between ancient wisdom and modern science is not a single story. It is a library, and we are going to walk through it together. One teaching at a time. Let me leave you with this. Psalm 150, the Psalm of Moses. begins before it gets to the verse about 1,000 years. It begins with something even more foundational. Moses writes, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Before the mountains, before the earth was formed, from everlasting to everlasting." Moses is not giving a devotional comfort verse about how God is always with us. He is making a cosmological statement. He is saying that there is an eternal ground that precedes the universe. That creation is not the beginning of God, but the beginning of what God chose to make. That before the Big Bang, before the first creative instant, before even the raw potential that would eventually become matter and energy and space and time, there was presence, not emptiness. Presence. And that presence is the same presence that the tradition has always called by the name that is too holy to speak casually. The name that does not translate perfectly into English because English was built for a smaller understanding of the world. The ancient text is holding something for us. Not something we can exhaust, not something we can fully decode, not in one lifetime, not in one generation, but something we can keep opening, layer by layer, with both the tools of scholarship and the tools of science, and find, again and again, that the words were written from a vantage point we are still working our way toward. The ancient words still speak. Write it. Share this video with one person today. One person who needs to know that the war between faith and knowledge is a war that was declared by people who had not read deeply enough on either side. One person who is tired of choosing. May the wisdom of the ancient world be a lamp to your feet in the modern one. May the numbers that confirm the age of the stars also confirm the faith that has carried your family across generations. May you find in the overlap of science and scripture not a compromise but a completion. The sense that both rivers, the river of revelation and the river of discovery, are running toward the same sea. And may the one who set the cosmos in motion, who hid the age of the universe in the mathematics of a medieval Kabbalist, who embedded the secrets of relativity in the commentary of a 13th century Talmudist, that one who is patient enough to wait 7 centuries for the instruments to catch up, be patient enough, and kind enough, and close enough, to meet you exactly where you are today. The ancient words still speak. Go in the knowledge that they were always speaking to you. There is one more layer to this teaching, and I am saving it for last because it is the most personal, the most intimate, and the most demanding. Everything I have shown you so far operates in the domain of history and mathematics. The Kabbalistic calculation, the relativistic physics, the convergence of ancient text and modern cosmology, all of that is real. All of that is documented. All of that stands on its own without any further argument from me. But here is what keeps me awake at night, not in anxiety, in wonder. If the sages encoded the age of the universe in their calculations, if they knew through the lens of revelation that the cosmos was billions of years old at a time when the surrounding world could not have imagined it, then what else did they know? What else is encoded in the ancient library that we have not yet had the sophistication to decode? What conversations between earth and eternity are sitting in the commentaries, in the Talmudic debates, in the Kabbalistic texts, in the structure of the Hebrew language itself, waiting for a physicist or a biologist or a neuroscientist in some future decade to come along and say, with the same awe I feel saying it now. They already knew this. This question is not rhetorical. It is the most productive scientific and spiritual question I know how to ask, because it assumes something foundational. It assumes that revelation and reality are the same thing approached from different directions. That the scientist who measures the echo of the Big Bang and the sage who studies the text of Genesis are not in different buildings looking at different objects. They are in the same building. One looking up from the basement and one looking down from the roof. And the building is the universe itself. I want to be careful here. I am not saying that the Torah is a physics textbook. I am not saying that every ancient text can be decoded into scientific data if you apply the right formula. I am saying something more careful and more powerful than that. I am saying that when a tradition produces a verified cosmological calculation 7 centuries before the science exists to confirm it, that tradition has earned the right to be taken seriously on its own terms. Earned it. Not because we respect it for cultural reasons. Not because we want to be inclusive, because the evidence demands it. Do you feel the difference between those two things, the difference between courtesy and evidence? Courtesy says, be respectful of ancient traditions. Evidence says this ancient tradition was right about something that took humanity thousands of years and billions of dollars in scientific infrastructure to verify. Those are not the same statement. One is manners, the other is epistemology. Now I want to go back to Psalm 91 more time, because there is something in it we have not fully unpacked. The psalm attributed to Moses does not begin with the verse about 1,000 years. It begins with a declaration so vast that most readers slide over it without stopping. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting. You are God, before the mountains, before the earth was formed, before the world. Moses is not describing a God who arrived at the beginning and has been here since. He is describing a God for whom the concept of beginning does not apply. From everlasting to everlasting. The technical term in modern cosmology for what existed before the Big Bang is something physicists are still debating, because the laws of physics as we know them break down at the singularity. There is no scientific language for what came before time. But Moses had language for it. Everlasting to everlasting. A presence that does not have a starting point because it is the ground from which starting points emerge. The great medieval philosopher and physician Maimonides, known as the Rambam, who lived from 1138 to 1204, argued that the creation of the universe does not mean that God is bound by time the way creation is. God is not in time. Time is in creation. And creation emerged from a source that has no temporal location because temporality itself is a feature of the created order. This is not mysticism. This is the Aristotelian Maimonidean framework of Jewish philosophy, one of the most rigorous intellectual traditions in the history of human thought, and it is entirely compatible with what contemporary physicists say about the relationship between time and the origin event of the universe. Time, in the standard model of cosmology, is not something that existed before the Big Bang and into which the Big Bang happened. Time itself began at the Big Bang, which means that asking what came before the Big Bang is like asking what is north of the North Pole. The question assumes a framework that does not apply. Moses knew. Maimonides articulated it philosophically. Einstein confirmed it mathematically. And yet somehow the cultural story is that religion and science are enemies. No, they are not. They are two traditions of awe, conducted in different languages, arriving at the same landscape from different trails, and the landscape is reality. It is one landscape, And the people who mapped it with equations and the people who mapped it with prayer were drawing maps of the same territory. Are you tired of being handed a smaller God than the universe requires? Have you ever sat in a moment of genuine wonder at the size of the cosmos? At the fact that the light now arriving from the most distant galaxies left its source before the Earth existed? And felt that wonder and your faith pulling in opposite directions? Do you feel in your deepest self that there has to be a way to hold both? To be intellectually honest and spiritually alive at the same time? Without apology, without compromise, without having to speak a different language at church than you do at work. That feeling is not confusion. That feeling is accuracy. That feeling is you sensing correctly that the split was artificial in the first place. The universe is approximately 8 billion years old. A medieval Kabbalist said 34 billion. A 20th century physicist using Nachmanides and Einstein said 75 billion. And Moses, in the psalm that bears his name, said that in God's sight, 1,000 years are like a day, encoding the very conversion factor that makes the calculation possible. This is not religion trying to catch up with science. This is an invitation to recognize that the deepest layers of the ancient tradition have been pointing at the same reality that science is still uncovering. The ancient words still speak. Write it in the comments. Share this with someone tonight who is still caught in the artificial war. And come back. Because this is one thread, and there are thousands more where it came from. Before I close, I want to speak one more time to a very specific person. You know who you are. You grew up in a faith tradition. You loved it. You were formed by it. And then you went to school. Or you started reading. Or you started asking hard questions. And somewhere along the way, the answers you were given felt thin. They felt like they were designed to end the conversation rather than deepen it. They felt like walls built to keep the questions out rather than rooms built to let the questions breathe. And slowly, over years, you drifted, not because you stopped believing, because the tradition you were handed felt too small for the universe you were inhabiting. I am not going to tell you to just come back and stop asking the hard questions. I am going to tell you something more specific. The tradition is not too small. The version of it you were handed was too small. The ancient library is deeper than what you have been shown. And the more you go down into it, the more you find that the questions you were taught to be afraid of are the exact questions the sages were already sitting with. They just answered them in a language that took centuries to translate into the vocabulary of modern science. Go deeper, not shallower. The answers are not on the surface. May the teaching you receive today be a doorway and not a destination. May the number 15 billion scratched into a medieval text and confirmed by orbiting satellites to be a reminder that the universe is not trying to argue you out of your faith. It is trying to confirm it at a depth you have not yet plumbed. May the one who hides wisdom in ancient numbers and reveals it in the fullness of time give you the patience and the courage to keep asking. Keep studying. Keep reaching. Until the faith that has carried your people across thousands of years of history becomes the faith that carries you across the full span of your own. The ancient words still speak. Go in peace. And that is enough. That has always been enough. The testimony of the cosmos is written in 2 books, the Book of Nature and the Book of Books.